Before we get started, I just wanted to let everyone know I've muted everyone on the line except for myself and Mark, just so we don't have any issues with any background noise. At the end of the session, I'll unmute everybody so we can do a quick question and answer session. Keep in mind that the webinar control panel has a chat box, so if you think of any questions, feel free to type them in there and we'll circle back through them at the end of the session. So without further ado, we're going to kick things off. So over to you, Mark.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. So good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. Thanks for joining us, and thanks, too, for Megan and Oxford University Press for handling all these technical details. Trust me, you're very glad that I'm not in charge of those. I wanted to talk today, as the title of the talk tells you, about the question of whether there are biological influences on sexual orientation in humans. And this question has become of some interest lately. And it's really part of a bigger question. I mean, which is why do men and women behave differently? You know, if you think about it for a moment, if you imagine you were the anthropologist from Mars who was coming here, you might think it's very strange that half the planet would find someone, say, Brad Pitt, to be an excellent mate choice, sexual partner, and the other half would find him absolutely unacceptable. And there's something strange about that dichotomy, if you think about it. And yet, of course, we've grown up with it. We know that it's quite real. And this is really just one example of the bigger question of why men and women act differently in any sphere of behavior. And, of course, there are some ways in which men and women are physically different. For example, men on average tend to be larger and stronger than women, and that might account for some cases where you'd expect men to be doing the heavy lifting versus women. But, of course, it doesn't always work out that way. But except for those sorts of trivial differences, the real differences in human behavior are probably not due to differences in the bodies, but rather due to differences in the brain. And so the question is, how do these sex differences in behavior arise? And people were first addressing this in animals, where over 50 years ago now, these scientists, Phoenix Goy, Gerald, and Young, came up with a remarkably simple mechanism to explain a wide range of sex differences in behavior in animal models. And it was and they got their inspiration from paying attention to what the scientists who were studying sexual differentiation of the body were finding. So in the 40s and 50s, scientists learned that in early embryonic development, we all start off looking much the same. That is, there are gonads that are present, and they don't quite look like ovaries, and they don't quite look like testes, and so they're called indifferent gonads. And in some people, those gonads start to develop to start looking like testes by about 8 weeks of gestation. And what the scientists were learning was that if testes arise, then they start releasing hormones that are going to masculinize the rest of the body. And in the absence of testes, if ovaries develop, they don't seem to be putting out much hormone early in life. And in the absence of any hormone early in life, the genitalia develop in a female fashion. And they were discovering that the primary agent from the testes that was masculinizing the body was an androgenic hormone called testosterone that we're all relatively familiar with. And there's something sort of pleasing and simple about this idea that there'd be a single signal, the hormonal signal from the testes, that would tell the body what sort of individual this was going to be and how they were going to reproduce. And what Phoenix Goy, Gerald, and Young were suggesting was that the same testicular steroids like testosterone that organize the developing genitalia in a masculine way were also just acting on the brain to make it masculine too. And again, it's easy to understand how a single unifying signal like that could coordinate things, so that and today we know if there's a Y chromosome, there's a gene on the Y that causes testes to develop, and then the testes start secreting testosterone, and the testosterone masculinizes the external genitalia. And all of this happens well before birth. In the absence of a Y chromosome, ovaries develop early in life. They're not secreting much hormone, but they're certainly not secreting much testosterone. And in the absence of testosterone, the external genitalia develop in a female fashion. What Phoenix Goy, Gerald, and Young were suggesting is that the same hormonal signal that's masculinizing the body is also masculinizing the brain. And in the presence of testosterone, the brain will be organized in a male-like fashion. And in the absence of testosterone, the brain will be organized in a female-like fashion. And that from that point on, the animal's behavior will be more likely to be masculine in this case and more likely to be feminine in this case. And, you know, for a remarkable number of different cases, this relatively simple rule has held up. So I've spent most of my life looking at sex differences in the brains of various animals. So I won't talk about the details of the, you know, they have names and all that, but there's some nuclei that are larger in males than in females. Sometimes they're dramatically larger. In other cases, they are somewhat larger in males than in females. You don't just see this in the brain, you can also see it in the spinal cord. I've done a lot of research trying to figure out why it is that these motor neurons in males survive early in life, and in females they die. There's been a lot of study in bird song systems where songbirds like canaries and zebra finches, there are parts of the brain that are involved in song, which males do more of than females do, that are bigger in males than in females. And so in all these cases, the theme that they all share is that you can make these brain regions as masculine or feminine as you like simply by controlling whether they're exposed to testosterone. And for most of these systems, they have to see testosterone early in life at some sensitive period in order to take on a masculine phenotype like this. And you know, for a remarkable number of systems, so far all of them, that simple rule has held up. And I've been very happy doing that sort of research. But through it all, you know, just because this is how things work in our animal models, that certainly is not convincing that it's working in people. And to tell you the truth, this the talk I want to give today is something of a confessional about a change of heart that I've had in the course of my professional career. Because most of the time when I was doing that sort of research in animals, I really was not at all convinced it had anything to do with sex differences in human behavior for a variety of reasons. The main reason is you don't have to think very hard or very long to think that there's an alternative hypothesis. That is, for humans, because we're born so immature, because we take so long to develop, because we are so dependent on other people, another possibility is that social experience is responsible for sex differences in our behavior, because we are so sensitive to social influences. We know that babies are treated differently depending on whether people think they are males or females. Children are constantly exposed to social roles, role models. To some extent, everyone serves as within a culture, serves as a member of the gender police that are very quick to tell, especially little boys, if they're not behaving the way our culture says little boys should behave, etc. And all that accumulated influence is certainly going to be affecting the brain. And so for me, it always seemed much more plausible to think that it was a social experience that was causing sex differences in behavior, and that the androgens that were so important for our animals, that they were probably less important in humans. And indeed, I think the one thing that's clear is they certainly are less important. And for me, it was just a question of whether they have any influence at all on human behavior. And if we were to take it to a specific question, it would be, do prenatal androgens like testosterone, are they responsible for the fact that almost all men are attracted to women and almost all women are attracted to men? And a simple way of thinking about this hypothesis would be to think that if we were to look at individuals and think about how much androgen they were exposed to prenatally during some sensitive period, that it might be that individuals who were exposed to a certain threshold level of testosterone would grow up to become attracted to women. And I need to introduce a technical term here. We'd say that these people are gynophilic because they are attracted to women. And that individuals who are exposed to less testosterone before birth, that when they grew up, that they would be attracted to men. We would say that they would be androphilic because they're attracted to those men. And the screen where the cartoon that we're showing suggests that there would be some overlap, and maybe some women, maybe the reason they're attracted to women is because they saw a little more testosterone, and maybe some men, the reason they're attracted to men is because they didn't see quite as much. And it's a relatively simple-minded hypothesis, but people have considered it. And the question then, so I want to make a point that I'm going to be talking for a while now about people who are the minority, who are attracted to the same sex. And I want to make it clear that it's not because I think homosexuality needs to be explained away, or certainly that it needs to be cured or anything like that. The reason homosexuals are interesting in these questions is because they are defying both hypotheses. They're neither conforming to the idea that social experience would be playing a role, nor are they conforming to the idea that androgens might be playing a role. And so the reason I'm so interested in homosexuals is because heterosexuals, are boring and uninformative. We have no idea whether most heterosexuals are attracted to the opposite sex because of social pressures. I mean, think of all those Disney movies in our culture, for example, or is it because of the differences in prenatal testosterone? So there's a very famous case that I was taught. This is really kind of interesting for me personally. So in my very first psychology class, introductory psychology, which I took in 1973, just to tell you how old I am, I remember vividly being told about this very strange case of these twin boys who, because of an accident, one boy lost his penis as a baby, and I was told that he was raised as a girl, and that this girl, the family was treating her as a girl, was dressing her as a girl, gave her a girl name, and that she was a well-adjusted young teenager these days. And so, to some extent, that was almost an existence proof. Here was someone whose brain had been exposed to testosterone before birth, but with socialization was a happily adjusted female. Well, the problem was, of course, it wasn't quite true. What we learned in 1997 in an article in the Rolling Stone magazine, my teenage son had a subscription at the time, and so I couldn't believe I was seeing this article on the front that was about this case. And what we learned was that, in fact, this child was not happy as a girl, did not feel comfortable being a girl, and as a young teenager, upon finding out the truth, rebelled and refused to be a girl and was living as a man. And so the Rolling Stone article was eventually made into a book, which is a fascinating read about this case. And here's a picture of the man who eventually called himself David. And so on the one hand, this then made it clear that the existence proof I had been told about as a freshman in college was not true. This case certainly does not prove that you can expose someone to testosterone before birth and then have them socialized to be a happily adjusted woman. And so for a lot of people who really favor biological influences on sexual orientation, this was seen as a really important case, validating their point of view. But again, I was always very skeptical of it. And there's many things about this case that are far from an ideal case for showing that there's biological influence. And I won't talk about them all. I mean, for one thing, the child was thought to be a boy until he was 7 months of age, and then there was a period where they weren't sure what to do before they decided to go on this program. And then, were his parents confused about his gender, et cetera? There were just all sorts of ways. It was sort of a contaminated case. And so I wasn't much convinced. Again, though, and you can read more about this. It's a tragic case. I mean, terrible. I mean, the family was really destroyed by this accident when these young boys were eventually the boy and his twin brother both committed suicide, and it's a very sad case. For people that think that there are biological influences, that prenatal hormone is important for human sexual orientation, another line of research that they found very persuasive, that frankly I didn't, involved a syndrome called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So congenital just means it's present at birth. And these are individuals who, because of a genetic problem, can't produce adrenal hormones like glucocorticoids. And so what happens is, prenatally, in the absence of these glucocorticoids, it causes changes that will, well, let me show you a cartoon, that these individuals, they can't make the glucocorticoids. So that's the problem they have. There's several different mutations that can cause that. And in the absence of those glucocorticoids, the brain, detecting the absence, starts calling for, releasing hormones to call for the glucocorticoids, but the adrenal glands can't make them. They sort of swell up in response to these additional hormones from the pituitary, and as a consequence, there's a spillover product where they start releasing androgens, including testosterone. And these androgens, when this happens in females, the androgens released before birth slightly masculinize genitalia, so that at birth, the babies will look something like this, for the ambiguous genitalia that look something in between a normal clitoris and a normal penis, an average clitoris and average penis, I should say. And in these individuals are typically at birth, they're given medicine so that their adrenal glands will stop producing androgens, and they need the medicine for other reasons too, for their health, and they're typically raised as girls. Well, for people that preferred or like the idea of hormonal influences on sexual orientation, they pointed out that when these girls grew up, they were more likely than the general population to be lesbians. And but on the other hand, most of them grow up to be straight. They get married, they have children, etc. And so this is I mean, it's an interesting case. As you look at the literature closely, it's a beautifully ambiguous case. It is perfectly unhelpful for deciding whether social or hormonal influences are at play. It's, you know, is the glass half empty or half full? Well, people that like the idea of biological influences see this as persuasive, and people who don't see it as unpersuasive. And me, as a skeptic, I really I didn't find it very persuasive. And I won't belabor it too much, but you can think about it yourself. When a baby is born with genitalia like that, you can think of all sorts of ways that just the fact that the genitalia are a little bit different and that people become aware of that, especially the parents, you can think of ways in which that might cause that child to have an atypical development of gender education, if you will, and that atypical education might make them slightly more likely to be homosexual when they grow up. It doesn't say that androgens aren't playing a role, but it's not very convincing. Another piece of research that have people thinking about biological influences on sexual orientation, which again many people found persuasive, but that I did not, was back in 1991 when Simon LeVay reported that this nucleus in the hypothalamus of humans called INA3, a horrible name, but a very useful nucleus. When he reported, he confirmed what other people reported, that this tends to be larger in males than in females. But what he also found was that the nucleus in homosexual males was more the size of females. That is, straight males had a larger INA3 than homosexual males who had an INA3 about the same size as in females. And so for many people, this fact that homosexuals were not just different on the outside, but that they were different in their brain, was for many people persuasive that homosexuality has a biological origin. But for me, and Simon LeVay, when he published this study, made a point of making the same case. Unfortunately, because you can only look at INA3 after death in post-mortem material, we really have no way of knowing, did these men, were they born with a small INA3 and that's why they became homosexual, or did something else cause them to develop as homosexuals and that caused their INA3 to be smaller? And you really can't distinguish between those possibilities. And again, if you like biological explanations, you can see this and say, "Ha, I told you so." But if you don't like biological explanations, or if you're more skeptical, you can think of lots of reasons why this really doesn't settle the issue of how these men came to be gay in the first place. So I was aware of all this, and of course I'd been doing research in animals, and I was really had never been tempted to look at people very much. I was perfectly content to look at animals and checked hormones and masculinized brains and all that. And then in 1998, I heard about a report that really, for the first time, caused me to think that maybe hormones really are playing a role in sexual orientation in humans. And it was a strange sort of report that involved this business of listening to tiny clicks that are coming from the ears. These things are known in the field as otoacoustic emissions, these tiny little sounds that are coming from ears. And so as I'm talking to you now, your ears are making little sounds in response to the things I'm saying. And you're not aware of them, of course, because your brain dampens them out. But these sounds are the result of things that your inner ear is doing in order to zero in and listen to the things I'm saying to you. And what's interesting about these otoacoustic emissions is that they're more, in general, the more of these sounds you make, the better your hearing is. And this includes the fact that women tend to make more of these sounds than men do, which is one of the reasons why women have better hearing than men do. And you know, when I'm talking to undergraduates, I make a point of saying I have no idea whether this has anything to do with sex differences in listening, but we know for a fact that there's a sex difference in hearing. And these otoacoustic emissions are one of the reasons that women are better at that. Well, so in 1998, Dennis McFadden reported, he had reported before that women tend to make more of these otoacoustic emissions than men do. And what's important for you to know, it was already established, that sex difference is already present at birth. So that's not the result of some social influences on, you know, encouraging girls to talk more, to listen better, because it's present at birth. And what he reported was that gay women make fewer of these otoacoustic emissions than do straight women. And bisexual women are sort of somewhere in between. And you know, this really, I mean, on the one hand, this is sort of a strange thing to be talking about, otoacoustic emissions. What can they possibly have to do with sexuality? Well, I think nothing. I don't see how they possibly could. But on the other hand, I couldn't see how I could explain this as being socially mediated. I mean, it's not like, I mean, since nobody knows these emissions are there, right? So it's not like, you know, girls were, you know, these women as girls were saying, well, gee, my ears don't make many clicks, and so maybe I'm supposed to be a guy. And it's not like, you know, the parents or teachers could say, well, gee, you're not making so many clicks. Are you sure you're supposed to be a girl? I mean, none of that could have been going on. I don't see how that's possible. And I really don't know how to explain, and I haven't gone over it, but there's good reason to think that this sex difference that's present at birth is due to the sex difference in testosterone exposure before birth. And so I really didn't see how to explain this difference between gay and straight women, except to say that the lesbians, on average, had been exposed to more prenatal testosterone than the straight women, and I don't know how that would have happened unless it is that more exposure to testosterone before birth makes one more likely to be a lesbian. And so I learned that in 1998, and then I was sitting in my office in 1999 when I read about this paper that talked about an even stranger characteristic than otoacoustic emissions. This paper that said that there was a difference. I mean, I've been studying sex differences all my adult life already, and I'd never heard about this sex difference in humans that has to do with the pattern of the length of the fingers. And what I read in this paper is that the sex difference is present at 2 years of age. Later, we'd learned that the sex difference is present well before birth. Because of the McFadden report, this really got me to thinking. So let me show you what the sex difference is. So the sex difference tends to be known as the 2D 4D ratio, 2D being the index finger and 4D being the ring finger. And so here's a fairly typical male hand. You can look where you can see that the index finger is a little bit shorter than the ring finger, and you can come up with a little ratio. You take the length of the index finger, divide it by the length of the ring finger, and in men it tends to be less than 1. In women, you're more likely to see a pattern like this, where the index finger might be a little bit longer than the ring finger, and when you do that ratio, it's more likely to be above 1. Now, I can't see you, so it's possible that right now some of you are looking at your right hand and noticing which digit is longer and which is shorter and things like this. So first, let me assure you, don't panic. Everything's fine. I'm going to walk you through. No matter what you see, everything's okay. So this sex difference is a small sex difference. When people look at the sex difference, it has a D prime, which is the average number of standard deviations different between the two, the number of standard deviations that differ in the average of the two groups, male and female. It's a medium effect at best, like about 0.5. And so Cohen would call that a medium effect, and he uses a great intuitive example to let you know what sort of effect that would be. He'd say, well, that's the difference in height between 14-year-old girls and 18-year-old girls. And so we all know that there would be a lot of overlap. There are some 14-year-old girls that are taller than some 18-year-old girls. So on the one hand, if I gave you a group of 20 girls and I said 10 of these are 14 and 10 of them are 18, and you use their height alone to decide who was the older and who was the younger, you'd make a lot of mistakes because there's lots of overlap. On the other hand, let me point out that if they're really random samples of 14 and 18-year-old girls, if I tell you one group of girls has a mean that's, 5'2", and the other group has a mean that's 5'6", then you have a pretty good idea of which one of those is the 14-year-olds and which one of the 18-year-olds. So in other words, all you can do is use it to compare groups. Well, and presumably any differences between, say, lesbians and straight women or between different kinds of males would have to be even smaller than 0.5. So this is a small difference if it's there at all. And so so here's a graphic that happens to be about 0.4 to give you some idea that there'd be a lot of overlap. So and here I can show you another. If we look at one of the papers that looked at the sex difference before birth, so these are in fetal individuals. You can see the age listed down here. You can see that there's so much overlap between males who tend to be circles and females who are conveyed as triangles here. So I won't spend some time asking, but you might wonder whether the sex difference in digit ratios really is due to prenatal testosterone. And the short answer is that that's really very firmly established. It clearly is. The only example I'll give you is to point out that if prenatal testosterone is responsible for this, then we would expect females with congenital adrenal hyperplasia, they should have masculinized digit ratios, right? And indeed, when we looked, we saw that for whatever reason, the right hand tends to have a bigger sex difference, seems to be more responsive to testosterone than the left. And no one has any explanation for why that should be so, but we see it quite consistently, and so do other people. Anyway, and we saw that indeed, relatively modest samples, that females who have CAH are more have a smaller digit ratio than control females. And the same year we published it, a group in Europe published the same thing. So it's and there's other evidence, but I won't bother you with it. Well, so once I learned that there was this this digit ratio difference, I happened to be at Berkeley at the time in the Bay Area, and so there's a pretty obvious question to ask, which is whether we could use this. And there's several things that are great about using these digit ratios as markers, sort of retrospective markers of prenatal testosterone. One thing that's great is that certainly back in 2000 when we were doing the study, nobody knew they were there. I mean, I'd never heard of them and read about it in 1999 for the first time. And so no one was looking at their digit ratios and wondering about this. The other thing that's great is you can just Xerox people's hands, and that means you can measure the digit ratios blindly. And so we went out to various street fairs in the Bay Area, and we asked people all sorts of questions about who they were attracted to and who they had fantasies about having sex with and things like that. And it turns out that people would gladly answer all those questions and let us Xerox their hands as long as we offered them a $1 lottery scratcher ticket. In my first foray into studying humans, what I learned is that humans will do anything for a $1 lottery scratcher ticket. They'll go pretty far anyway. And so we asked whether sexual orientation co-varies with digit ratios. And what we found, and again, the right hand is where we saw a sex difference. Notice we didn't even quite see a sex difference on the left hand, so that indicates that it's more sensitive to testosterone. We saw the sex difference that other people told us about, that is, the digit ratios are smaller in men than in women. But we also found that lesbians, homosexual women, have a more masculine digit ratio than straight women. And again, because no one knew these differences in digit ratio were there, again, I don't see how I can explain this as a socially mediated effect. I don't think any little girls were looking at their hands and saying, well, gosh, that looks kind of masculine. Maybe I should be attracted to Susie. I mean, and I don't think any parents or teachers were looking at that. So what I love is that it's sort of a hidden indicator of prenatal testosterone. And I really don't know how to explain this difference except that way. The next year we went to another street fair, got another sample, and this time we went to the East Bay where there are loads of lesbians around, and we asked one more question. We said, well, how would you describe yourself, as butch or femme? And what we found was that, again, on the right hand, that it was only the butch lesbians who had a more masculine digit ratio. The femme lesbians didn't. And so, again, I don't know how to explain that except to say that these women, on average, saw slightly more testosterone than these women did before birth, and that seeing more testosterone made them more likely to be butch when they grew up. Notice, though, that these women, since they have fairly normal digit ratios, there's no indication that they saw prenatal testosterone any more than anyone else, and so they got to homosexuality. They became lesbians through some other route. Presumably has nothing to do with prenatal testosterone. I'm quite sure that that's possible and that happens. Well, this study made quite a stir, and one of the things that's great about digit ratios is it's not like you need a cyclotron to do the study. So we published that in 2000, and then there were lots of groups published replications. For a while there, every calendar year, there was a new replication out there. In some ways, this is my favorite, this Hall and Love 2003. They got 7 pairs of monozygotic twins, so identical twins, females, who were discordant for sexual orientation, and they saw a difference. That is, that the lesbian twin had a more masculine digit ratio on average than the straight twin. And what's interesting about that is that lets us know that even if you have the same genes, that doesn't mean that you'll necessarily be exposed to the same amount of prenatal testosterone, and it doesn't mean that you'll necessarily, of course, have the same sexual orientation. I can tell you that there was at least one study that I think was well done that didn't see a difference. But when you put it all together, there was a meta-analysis that was published a few years ago that concluded that indeed the difference is real, and you'd need 58 null findings in a row to doubt that lesbians have a more masculine digit ratio than straight women. Well, so among the and the other thing is that these digit ratio data, that they fit. I mean, they fit with the otoacoustic emissions. Remember, that was different in lesbians versus straight women. There are also some skeletal ratios that I haven't talked about, that are these subtle sex differences that suggest that lesbians saw more prenatal testosterone. The fact that females with CAH are more likely to be lesbian is, of course, consistent with that finding, and the fact that there are genetic influences on sexual orientation, some of which might be involved in hormonal systems, also seem to be consistent with that idea. Well, a lot of people were upset about this finding and I think for the wrong reasons. So here's in Salon, there was a sociology professor from Barnett who was very angry at us for having done the question. They said that we were mean-spirited scientists that were even asking whether there'd be such an effect. So she identifies as lesbian, and she said she looked at her hand and she saw that, well, yeah, I guess it must be that her digit ratio was, that her index finger was shorter than her ring finger, and so she fits that, and then she was wondering about her daughter, et cetera. And it's really unfortunate. She misunderstood the nature of these findings. So it happens a lot. And so I'll have a little exercise here. I'm going to, if you'd like, I'm going to teach you all the secret to how to take a random sample of people, look at their hands, and guess their sexual orientation, and you're going to be right 95% of the time. And I'm just presuming, I can't hear you, but I'm presuming that you'd like me to teach you how to do this. So here's what you do. You get your random sample people, and then you look at the right hand. You can look at your right hand now to help yourself along. You look at the right hand, and you notice very carefully whether the ring finger is longer or shorter than the index finger. And then no matter what you see, guess that they are straight. And if indeed it was a random sample of people, you will be right 95% of the time. And because 95% of people are straight. And in fact, no matter what you see in the digit ratios, anytime you guess that they're gay, that they're lesbians, your hit rate's almost certainly going to go down. So the point of this is that while the digit ratios are good for comparing groups, they're lousy for classifying individuals. You can't do that. So you can't look at someone's hand and make an intelligent guess as to their sexual orientation. Or if you do that, you're going to be wrong a lot. And indeed, why do you want to do that? I mean, I was a little perplexed that people wanted to use this system to try to tell whether someone is gay or straight. I mean, we already know how to tell whether someone is gay or straight. We just ask them, right? And if they feel safe, they'll tell us. So in other words, it's not a shibboleth in it. And if you want an interesting discourse and where that word shibboleth came from, you can check out the Bible. So if I may go back, as I look at what the digit ratio suggests to us, it is not that all individuals who are lesbians got there because of prenatal testosterone, but that those individuals who are exposed to more prenatal testosterone, those women are more likely to be gay when they grow up. And but what about men? Well, so, I mean, if the finding in women suggests that prenatal testosterone does indeed make one likely to grow up to be gynophilic, right? And so maybe that's why 95% of men are gynophilic, because of the prenatal testosterone. But on the other hand, of course, some men aren't attracted to women. And so are homosexuals, are those the result of not seeing enough prenatal testosterone? Well, I don't think so. In fact, there's not much evidence for that. So here, for example, I'm showing you this graph again. Notice that for the straight men versus homosexual men on the right hand, there's really no difference whatsoever. And the meta-analysis I told you about that looked at, I mean, lots of other people had looked at digit ratios in men. Actually, some had we didn't see a difference. Some had seen a difference where gay men seemed more feminine, but other people were reporting that gay men seemed more masculine. And most people reported no difference, just as we did. And when you do the meta-analysis, there's no difference. And remember, too, Dennis McFadden, I didn't point it out at the time, he also looked at straight men versus gay men, and he saw absolutely no difference between those groups. There was just no statistical difference between them. And so I don't think there's much evidence that homosexual males differ in terms of how much prenatal testosterone they saw. And now, on the one hand, that might seem like a paradox to you. How can it be that prenatal testosterone makes girls more likely to be gynophilic, but it isn't responsible for guys who are androphilic? Well, again, from the animal literature, this is pretty easy to understand. This is an old study where they asked whether guinea pig males who really like to copulate versus guinea pig males who don't like to copulate, whether they might differ in how much hormone they have available. And they couldn't measure hormone in those days. This is way back even before I was born. But they were great scientists anyway. And so what they did was they took a group of guinea pigs and they classified these males as to whether they copulated vigorously or not so vigorously or somewhere in between, and then they castrated them. And they knew, as people had known for quite some time, that after a few weeks all the males would stop copulating. And then they couldn't measure testosterone, but they could give it. So then they gave all the males low doses of testosterone, and lo and behold, the copulatory behavior returned, as they knew it would. But the interesting thing was that those males who had copulated a lot before copulated a lot now, and those who hadn't copulated so much didn't. And increasing the dose of testosterone didn't change that. So the variance in copulatory vigor in these animals was not due to variance in hormone. They were all getting hormone, only some were more responsive to it than others. And what we learned in rats is that, in fact, in rats, you can give the male rats 1/10 as much testosterone as they normally had, and that'll completely maintain their copulatory behavior as though nothing happened. So they're all getting lots more testosterone than they need to get as much boost of copulatory behavior as testosterone is going to give them. So in the field, we talk about androgen having a permissive effect. If you take the androgen away, they'll stop copulating. But after that, if you give them testosterone, then they'll start copulating. But then after that, differences in copulatory vigor are due to something else, but not due. It's due rather to how the individuals differ in their response to the hormone. And so maybe there's something like that's going on too, where prenatal in humans, where prenatal testosterone has a permissive effect. And so in that case, all the males got all the testosterone they needed to be as gynophilic as testosterone can make them. But for some reason, there's a minority of males that aren't responding to the hormone in such a way that they become gynophilic. And so I'm suggesting that the variance between gay and straight men isn't due to differences in prenatal testosterone, but rather differences in the way they respond to the hormone. And so they're all getting the same signal, but they're not all responding. And to understand how that might be, I need to give you a little bit of detail about how hormones work. So that the testosterone is a steroid hormone. It enters cells. If it's a target cell, there'll be a specialized receptor called the androgen receptor that binds to the hormone. Then the androgen receptor and the hormone together bind to DNA, and they alter gene expression. So they cause some proteins to increase production and some to decrease, et cetera. And in that way, they affect the fate of the cell. Well, in fact, what we know is that when testosterone acts through androgen receptor on the body, that the testosterone is binding to the androgen receptor and then regulating certain genes for in the tissue. But the other thing we know is that the same hormone and receptor works in many different tissues and can cause very different effects in different tissues. So, and in fact, is regulating different genes in different tissues, and that's just the way steroid hormones work. So knowing this, we can go back to the question, well, so is there any evidence that gay men are under-masculinized? I mean, we know that they tend to be attracted to the same sex partners that women tend to be. But other than that, is there reason to think that they're under-masculinized, that might suggest they're getting too little testosterone? Well, some of the sex differences in human behavior that people have spent some time studying, things like spatial rotation and verbal skills, where women tend to do better than men, or math, where men tend to do better than women, although that sex difference has been shrinking in our country. And in Iceland these days, girls on average score better than guys. And so that sex difference may have been completely culturally determined. Anyway, there in all of these differences, aggression-related rough and tumble play and things like that, in all of these ways, gay men are, in at least some studies, have been found to be different from straight men and more like women in those regards. But, and you know, as psychologists, we care about these differences a lot. But, you know, these are the tiny differences in human sex differences in behavior. The big sex differences in human behavior all have to do with sex. So the fact that men are more interested in casual sex, you know, that's a much bigger effect. Or attraction to older partner. Women tend to like an older partner, men don't. Concern for the partner's attractiveness, or frequency of masturbation, or interest in visual pornography. Look at them. This is more than twice as large as any of those cognitive sex differences. And the point I want to make to you is that in all of these ways, gay men are just as masculine as straight men. There's no evidence that they're under-masculinized in that regard. And how would you explain that? If you thought the sex difference was due to prenatal testosterone, then how would you explain that gay men are just as masculine if you really thought they were the result of too little testosterone before birth? I mean, I really don't think that makes any sense. And this interest in visual pornography, for example, I'll show you a little joke. So give you a chance to read that. Now, the main reason I show this is to point out to you that we all know what was in the window that the gentleman was looking at. And think about how big the sex difference is. If we were to replace the husband and wife, swap their positions here, we would have no idea what this joke is about. we would, well, what was she looking at? That doesn't, we can't even conceive of it. So in that way, gay men are masculine. And so I really think that the difference between gay and straight men is not due to differences in testosterone exposure or differences in how the androgen receptor responds to it, but rather it's got to be due to differences in how different tissues respond to testosterone. And in terms of digit growth and genitalia, I didn't say this, but a couple of studies have measured, and it turns out, if anything, gay men have larger penises than straight men. Well, how would you explain that if you thought they were seeing less prenatal testosterone? And in terms of sex drive, et cetera, they're at least as masculine as straight men. And so the one thing that's different is a difference in orientation. So it's always possible that there's a different set of genes that normally respond to testosterone to guide development of sexual orientation, and that what distinguishes gay and straight men is that their genes are not responding to this signal in the same way. And whatever these genes are, they're probably the same genes that are responsible, that are playing a role at least, in the cognitive differences that we talked about. Well, so I think that the difference between the variance between gay and straight men is not due to variance in prenatal testosterone levels, but rather is due to differences in genes. And of course, I have no idea which genes are responsible for this, but I know that people are looking hard, and I'm going to put my money on saying that they're going to find some genes that are responsible for that, and that some of these genes are going to be genes expressed in the brain that normally respond to testosterone. We do know that there's a gene on the X chromosome that makes it more likely that men will be gay. We don't know what the gene is, and we don't know whether it has any influence or whether it plays any role in testosterone signaling. There's another another line of evidence that there's a biological influence on sexual orientation in males that I don't really have time to talk about a lot. It's this older brother effect, this fact that when a boy is born today, for each additional older brother his mother carried before him, that boy's chance of being gay when he grows up goes up by 1/3. Now, I need to warn you that the first boy only has like a 2% chance. So the next kid has like a 2.6% chance, et cetera. So even most men with 5 or 6 older brothers are, of course, straight. And of course, there are a lot more first sons than any other kind, so there's plenty of oldest sons who are gay. But when you take all the numbers and put them together, as Ray Blanchard did, it looks like about 15% of gay men, about 1 out of every 7, are gay because their mother had sons before them. And I want to emphasize that these same men, raised by the same parents with the same genes, if their mothers had girls before them, they would be straight today. And it comes to be about 1 million men in North America today. And the other, I won't review the evidence, but we know that this is probably not a socially mediated effect because, for one thing, older stepbrothers have absolutely no influence on this, and older brothers who are raised apart have just as much of an effect on the boy's later sexual orientation as older brothers who are raised with them. So that's one evidence that, in fact, this is not socially mediated. Another is this very curious fact that what I just told you about the effect of older brothers only applies to boys who are right-handed. So here, if they have 1 older brother, they have a 2% chance. By the time they have 5 older brothers, they've got almost a 6% chance. But if the boys are not right-handed, there's absolutely no response whatsoever. So I have no, and Ray Blanchard put this data together, including data from our data set. So I'm a co-author on this, and it was really one of those things that sort of stunned me to think about this, because there's just absolutely no effect in the non-right-handed boys. Anyway, so we don't know why, but if your brain's organized in a left-handed fashion, for some reason you're not responding to this older brother effect. And so so it's not socially mediated, and it's got to be biological because it's got to be prenatal, right? The only thing those boys with the older brothers raised apart had in common with their older brothers was the mother. Somehow her body's remembering, and somehow her body's doing something to subsequent boys to make them more likely to be gay. Well, so if you put all these things together, I mean, what I've been trying to put across is that this is Francis Bacon, when he more or less began modern science and the Enlightenment, one of those that did. He talked about the instances of the finger post, the fact that if you want to understand something, you can't zero in on one little thing. You have to step back and look at lots of different pieces of evidence, and the way to know which is the right thing is when there are lots of different things that are pointing to the same idea. So what he called the instances of the finger post, and so in this regard, in females, where do they point? Well, there are all these things. The fact that CH does influence sexual orientation, the fact that lesbians have more masculine otoacoustic emissions, more masculine digit ratios, more masculine skeletal ratios. I didn't talk about. There's some other differences where lesbians are more masculine than straight women. You put that all together, and you have to conclude that girls who are exposed to more prenatal testosterone are more likely to be gay when they grow up. Not that they're certain to be gay, but they're more likely. And for males, the fact that there are genes that are having an influence. I didn't talk about sexual antagonism effect, but we could. Older brother effect. The fact that boys who are gender nonconforming, when they're little, we know that they're quite likely to be gay when they grow up. Most of them will be perfectly happy to be male, but they're more likely to be gay. And so there are some sort of processes that are at work before birth that are influencing sexual orientation in males, but it's probably not differences in prenatal testosterone. And so now, having talked about all these bits of evidence that there are biological influences on sexual orientation, I have to have a warning. So I'm not a biological determinist by any means, and I'm not trying to present a simple-minded view here. Of course, human behavior is overdetermined. We are so sensitive to so many influences that, of course, we are. There's not going to be a single factor that is going to explain any important behavioral trait. On the other hand, the fact that we can look at these populations and see that lesbians on average saw more prenatal testosterone, can see that boys with older brothers are more likely to be gay. The fact that we see that those factors that we can see that they play an influence tells us that there are some biological factors in this. And so if that matters, I'm not trying to say that nature is everything. That'd be a stupid position, I think. And I'm certainly not trying to say that nurture is everything. But rather, the way I like to say it is that despite the fact that we are incredibly socially sensitive, and in fact, despite the fact that our culture is so important, having such a big influence on our lives, that despite all that nature also does have a say. And I'm someone who's gone from 15 years ago being completely unconvinced that nature has a say in human sexual orientation. I really don't see how you can look at all those finger posts and not agree that nature does have a say. And so that's why we're trying to have a project where we try to get this information out to more people, and you can learn more about it there. And so thank you for your time and attention. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, so I'm slowly just going to unmute everybody on the line, and then we can go into a question and answer session.
Hello, anyone there? Okay.
Let's
see.
Marc,
so, yeah.
Marc, I had a quick question.
Good.
I'm sure you're familiar with the research. I believe it was Gorski that did, where he took rats of various ages and injected them with synthetic opposite-sex steroids. So if I remember correctly, what he found is that when you took adult rats and injected them with the opposite-sex hormones, you didn't see behavioral differences, but when you caught them prenatally or at birth, you did.
You're exactly. I'm sorry, I don't know who that is that was just talking. Was that Jay?
I'm Jay Green. I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
Jay. Okay, so I'm not good at reading this. So no, you're absolutely. Your memory is absolutely right, Jay. That's exactly what he found. And while he was doing those studies, I was there in anatomy at UCLA. I was over in the psychology department getting my PhD, and Roger was on my dissertation. And so That's exactly right. So that nucleus I showed in the earlier slide of some brain sections, that top nucleus was one that he was studying, and he really found that he could make that nucleus as masculine or feminine as he wanted. But if he wanted to be masculine, it had to be exposed to testosterone early in life. And the best thing was to expose it to testosterone just before birth and for a little bit just after. And you know, I never had any trouble believing that about rats. I always thought it was so cool. And those early testosterone will also masculinize the animal's behavior in various ways for the rest of its life.
The other real quick follow-up question. I don't think you mentioned it, but there's some statistical differences, I guess, in numbers that men are much more likely to have a purely homosexual orientation than women, while women are much more likely to have a bisexual orientation than men.
Yes, I mean that is a pretty consistent finding. I mean, we know that there are some women who, at one point in their lives, tell us that they had one sexual orientation, and we have no reason to not believe them. And then, you know, at another time in their lives, they fall in love with someone else who happens to be of, you know, the same sex. And so we know that can happen. And it's difficult to see how prenatal testosterone could be responsible for that. So we know that that's possible. And these days, I've been thinking that there is sort of a difference between men and women in terms of their sexual attitudes, which is that I think for most men, there's the preferred sex of a partner and the non-preferred sex. And I think for most men, it's not just that they prefer one partner over the other. It is they really find the idea of that other partner, they really find that repulsive. I mean, they really find that aversive. And I do, you know, I don't have any evidence for this, but I do wonder if that's one difference in sexual attitudes between men and women, is that men, that there's an aversive component to sexual orientation in males that isn't necessarily there or isn't as strong in females, so that women can fall in love with, maybe some women at least can fall in love with someone no matter what their sex is, that their gender's not so important because they're not finding that aversive. Anyway, that's my speculation, Jay.
Do you think that's mediated biologically, or is it socially, or maybe a little of both?
Well, I imagine it's a little bit of both, but if it is biological, you'd think it might be because, you know, out there in nature, males have to compete for mates in a way that females don't, and that's, you know, that's not just in humans, but across all the mammals, really.
Does anyone have any other questions?
I have a quick question.
Hi.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Hi there, I hear you.
This is Susan Thompson in Rochester, New York.
Hi,
and
Susan.
You touched briefly on the childhood gender nonconformity studies, but you just mentioned them with respect to men. Mm-hmm. And I've seen a video clip where you're talking about that research with where people are watching videotapes of little kids playing, mm-hmm. and they can guess, you know, more reliably than you would expect by chance whether those kids will end up being gay or straight. And so I was wondering if you could touch on what we know about childhood gender patterns in young girls and the likelihood of them growing up to be straight or growing up to be lesbians.
Yeah, it's a great question, Susan, and there's clearly a difference here. So indeed, most boys who are gender nonconforming, the vast majority, when they grow up, we know will be straight. They won't be transsexual, but they will be, or transgendered, but they will be. They'll be gay. And that's not true for most girls who are gender nonconforming. So girls who are gender nonconforming are more likely to be lesbians when they grow up than gender conforming girls. That's true, but it isn't nearly as large an effect. And it's interesting to speculate whether that's because, you know, is it because in fact women are females, I should say, are more open to falling in love with anyone, and so that these girls, they're
give me just a second, all right? Yep.
masculine in some ways, maybe once society tells them what they're supposed to do, they're able to do that and be perfectly happy at that. but the other possibility that I always think of is that there's a social aspect to it too, in that the gender police really get upset when boys don't conform, and they're much more forgiving when girls don't conform. It's okay to be a tomboy, that's kind of cute, but a boy that wants to play with Barbies, everybody starts frowning and getting concerned, et cetera. And so another difference is gender nonconforming boys, they're really bucking the social trend. I mean, they're really, and so they may be a more select group because they're really persisting in this behavior, even though lots of people are unhappy about it, and their peers, of course, are really unhappy about it.
Can I ask a slightly more subtle question, which is it the case that a young girl who likes very girly things, likes to dress as a little ballerina and play with Barbies and blah, 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 is she very unlikely to grow up to be a lesbian?
I don't know the answer to that. Will she become a cheerleader, and does that mean she'll never be lesbian? I don't. What we know from and this is Michael Bailey and Ken Zucker who did these sorts of studies. What we know is that when you find lesbians today and ask them about gender nonconforming behavior, that they're more likely to report having engaged in that. But the other thing we know is that there are lots of lesbians who report absolutely no such gender nonconforming behavior. So was one of the things I meant when the difference isn't as big. And so certainly there are lesbians who had no problem being girly girls, to use a technical term, I guess. And so there's certainly nothing about being a girly girl that means they can't be attracted to women someday.
Thank you.
Sure.
Mark, I have a question.
Okay, is that Ralph?
Yes.
Okay, I'm just figuring out this this panel here. Okay.
I posted something else with regard to the mother's prenatal hormonal. I had heard that a few years ago as part of an overall study of twins and other aspects. My question, however, is are you aware of any studies that are looking at the specific parts of the brain that activate differently via sexual orientation, whether male or female?
I know that there are such studies out there, and they're difficult to, as always with functional MRI studies, they can be somewhat problematic to interpret. It's not always clear what it means when one group shows more activation in one area than the other, or when there's a difference between them. And I know that there are differences in brain responses to various odors, for example, some of which might be regarded as might be related to sexual behavior in humans. And so surely, but to some extent, I just want to point out to you that surely gay men and straight men would respond differently to pictures of naked people of one gender versus the other. But that won't tell us how they came to be different in their response. And so I don't know that anyone's, and I think it would be very hard, I don't know that anyone's doing the very difficult thing of taking people, young people, and trying to map their brain activation early in life to predict whether they be gay or straight. I mean, I really don't. I think that'd be a terrible dissertation topic, and I really, I'd be very. I really doubt that anyone would be able to find anything. Would be able to find something that lets them predict someone's sexual orientation. I think much more likely that we'll find genes. I don't. There's not going to be a gay gene where you get this gene and you'll be gay no matter what. Clearly, that doesn't exist. But if they find certain genes that really increase the likelihood that someone will be gay or straight, then Ralph, then the thing is you can start asking, well, what parts of the brain use that gene? And that I think would be a more fruitful avenue someday.
Okay. With a quick follow-up related, are you aware of any studies, et cetera, particular neurotransmitters that are involved?
I can't think of any, but I'm not at all. I wouldn't say that there aren't such. And of course, these days, there's a lot of interest in neurotransmitter
genes related to neurotransmitter function, so serotonin transporters and things like that. And I don't know if anyone has done that, Ralph. And I'm a little bit worried that my memory's nagging that there is something, and I can't pull it up. But
that's okay. I just want to know if you were aware of some stuff, and I mean I can always do a look for it, but I just want to know if you knew of anything in particular.
No, I can't. Not that I can think of.
Okay. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it very much.
Oh, great. Thanks.
Mark, is Dean Hamer still claiming that there's a gay gene? I mean, is he still claiming that?
I don't know if he ever claimed that there was a gay gene, but it was his data I was showing when I showed that pedigree. That was from his study. But he does still think, and I think he's right, that there is a gene on the Q end of the X chromosome that, when it happens in males, makes them more likely to be gay. That study met with a lot of criticism and skepticism, and he later then gathered a new data set and replicated it, and then another group gathered a set and didn't see as much of an effect. But you put all the data that's been gathered together, and it's still true. There's something on that end of the X chromosome that is more likely. The specific study was, when you look at pairs of brothers who are gay, they are more likely to share that end of the X chromosome than you would expect by pure chance alone. And so yes, as far as I know, that's still there. I don't think anyone would call it a gay gene. It is a gene. I mean, the press did, of course, but it is a gene that makes it more likely that a male will be gay. And what I don't know, and I know that right now in Chicago, there's a big study going on where they're doing a screen looking at lots of genes, and it'll be interesting to see. As far as I know, the results aren't out yet, but it'll be interesting to see whether they pinpoint a particular gene on the X chromosome in that region.
Yeah, I do agree there's something going on in the X chromosome. I think the last thing I saw was that there's a collection of about 40 or so that they strongly suspect are involved in that. But
right, that's as close as they've been able to narrow it down, which is
yeah.
I mean, it's frustrating, of course. You'd love to have a specific gene to study and think about.
And you said it was on the Q end of the X?
That's right. I mean, by convention, chromosomes, they always label one in the P and one in the Q, and I mean, you can't make this stuff up really, but it makes it so much easier to remember that it's at the Q end.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, so I just want to let everybody know that I'll be sending a follow-up email out after the webinar, and there's going to be a link to a short online survey, and we'd be really appreciative if you could all fill it out. It'll help us improve our webinars going forward. And once again, I just want to thank everybody for attending today and for sharing your thoughts, and also a big thanks to Mark for presenting to us today.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you.